Hello and welcome to a special episode of Foreign Pulse. Usually I bring to you three important developments of the current week and we dissect them for analysis and for understanding and for deeper thinking about major international, global political and economic stories. But today I want your attention to something else. It's a kind of a phenomenon that's taken over and is defining the contemporary world order. This is what we call right-wing populism, and it has swept especially across the Western world, in Europe and in North America. And the repercussions of this right-wing populism is the theme of this special episode. We are going to be looking at three aspects of right-wing populism today. The first is on this impact on migration and refugees. The second is on wars and ethnic cleansing and major human rights abuses. And the third is what this right-wing populism is doing to the issue of climate change. All these are burning international issues of common concern for all of us, and yet the right-wing populists, by dividing the society of us against them and nationalism versus internationalism, they have created a lot of binaries that is leading to less consensus, more friction and more problems for international cooperation, for multilateral solutions. Those are in short supply today. So to discuss this phenomenon and its ramifications, I am very pleased to introduce to you my friend and colleague Professor Veselin Popovsky. He is the guest analyst today in this show, and he is a very senior scholar on global governance issues on the United Nations system. So thank you, Veselin, for being with us. Let's kickstart today's show. The most emotional issue on which right-wing populism has risen and has suddenly taken over many countries in the Western world, with the United States leading the pack, is migration. Populists believe that migration is a major national security threat, that hordes of outsiders, be it Hispanics or Muslims, are invading these countries and are changing the social dynamic and are threatening local jobs and local culture, and there is a pushback, a huge attempt to roll back the principle of open doors and open borders, which was the basis for the liberal international system for the last 25 years, and now that is under challenge. Let's hear this report first.
Anti-immigrant sentiment is the core principle of right-wing populism. Branding refugees and migrants as criminals and closing borders to them has become common in America and Europe. Hate crimes against asylum seekers and fears of them being terrorists and rapists have been exploited by populists to win elections. This hardening is happening even as the total number of refugees and displaced people has risen to record levels of more than 65 million. Will unresolved migration and refugee crisis worsen armed conflicts around the world? Why are the United Nations, the European Union and other multilateral bodies failing to protect migrants from the populist wave?
So why are international organizations so paralyzed with the populists mobilizing their mass constituencies to oppose migration and to paint this as a major threat? As a matter of fact, neither in Europe nor in America have migrants and refugees swollen in very large numbers. Statistically, that's not true. Yet, emotionally, symbolically, and for polarization, the populists have been able to show migrants as a kind of a cancer that is taking over the country and must be somehow stopped by closing borders, by deporting illegal aliens, and as we saw in the report, also interdicting migrants if they are trying to cross the Mediterranean by sea. Thousands of people have died, and it doesn't look like there is any kind of a cooperation going on among countries concerned to try and resolve this, because the nationalism of the populists, be it Trump in America, be it the Hungarians, we discussed Viktor Orban in another episode of Foreign Pulse before, Poland, Czech Republic, many countries even in the heart of Europe are opposed. Italy, slowly it is going in a direction where they want to close their doors and say that we don't want these unwanted people. So where will they go? And is it not the responsibility, a collective responsibility of the international community to protect these unfortunate people who are leaving their home countries but are not finding refuge anywhere? So, Veselin, it looks like migration, however illogical and irrational it is something that really works for the populists in terms of winning votes with their majority basis, and by vilifying them and showing them in a negative light. But clearly, what is the way out of this? Because it doesn't look like the populists can be halted, because when the moment they say that these foreigners are out to come and corrupt our values or take away our jobs, there is a big population at the grassroots who are economically not doing so well and suddenly become prey to these. It's a bit like the fascist era of the 1920s, when in Italy and Germany they were using these slogans, xenophobic and racist things, and it seems to be working, and clearly we have no answers for it.
You're absolutely right, Sreeram. Populists use migration as a strong tool, exactly because migration creates fears among the people, and they are easily manipulated on issues like you're correct. If you go back to the history, this is exactly what Hitler and Mussolini were doing in 1920s and 1930s, and this is exactly our danger today if populism wins votes, and Mussolini and Hitler also came to power after elections. So the danger is there, and migration is misrepresented as dangerous for everyone. Well, myself, I'm a migrant. I changed 5 times my country. My daughter is 20 years old, and she changed 5 times her country of where she is. So when somebody says that migrants are rapists, and I cannot stop laughing at such accusations, because exactly half of the world population today migrate from one country to another. I was in a conference when somebody was trying to say that migration and health are connected issues because migrants spread diseases. This is absolute laughable lie. I mean, migrants move one and they settle where they move. They never move after, exactly because they expect their documents and passport. Those who spread diseases are you and me, who travel every month somewhere around the world, and we are the health hazard, not the migrants.
So, Veselin, what can we do about this scapegoating that we're talking about? I mean, the liberal international institutions like the UN system, the lawyers, the human rights community, the ones who traditionally defend the migrants are on the defensive, in the sense they're not able to really cut across to the general public and mobilize them emotionally the way the populists are doing. And so, what is the recourse now?
Yes, exactly. You are right. Populism is on the rise, where liberalism is on retreat. And we see that, and that's the danger, as I mentioned, if we don't speak up about those things. United Nations is limited. It's also a scapegoat of its own problems, that everybody comes to United Nations when it comes to mission impossible, like Syria or like conflicts. But some successes of the United Nations are less visible, and these are in, for example, preventing diseases, assisting in humanitarian disasters, in natural disasters, and so on. So exactly, it's a difficult time for the liberals, and it's a very easy time for populists to win their agenda. And unfortunately, we live in such a period of time when United Nations itself, although the agenda of the new Secretary General Antonio Guterres is very much focused on migration, on prevention, on strengthening the multilateralism, we see with major powers such as United States being isolationist, actually anti-multilateral, a trend which very much reminds early 2000, when we similarly had the American administration. John Bolton is back in
all of them opposing any kind of cooperation or regional solutions and doing unilateral.
Multilateralism is under challenge.
And the migrants, you can say, are actually victims of this larger process that's happening.
Unfortunately, I'm skeptical, and I don't see much hope at the moment.
And one of the things, Veselin, is that the liberals always say that the facts are on our side. Migrants actually add economic value to the host countries. Migrants do not increase crime rates. these migrants rarely are involved in any assaults or terrorism, and yet they are being branded like this, and that this is factually incorrect. But it seems like Trump and the far right, the populists who are winning through emotions,
yes,
do not care about statistics or facts, because they are talking about the post-fact world.
They stigmatize the foreign enemy. Migrants are an easy group to stigmatize and to present as criminals and rapists. And it worked very well exactly for someone like Donald Trump, who wants to win the next elections and who is very worried about everything else. But that's why he wants to look strong in condemning some, even if you look at the facts, they are against what Donald Trump is talking about. But the problem with populism is that the truth itself is not
obfuscated. Okay. So important point for the viewers is that Donald Trump has just said something in early May, that we are going to shut up the country for some time, close it down, and then we'll have tremendous security. But the point is, homeland security, in the name of homeland security, setting up a wall or border fences and deportations, these ultimately will increase the overall regional insecurity. And that's the point. The nationalists don't care about what is happening outside their own borders, and they're only concerned about their own narrow interests, and that is the big challenge. But similar one, which perhaps is even bigger, is the issue of unending warfare, violence, major abuses, ethnic cleansing. Let's hear this report and come back.
Unending war and suffering in countries like Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Ukraine and the Congo have exposed the fragile nature of the international system. Deep divisions and tussles among the big powers in the United Nations Security Council, as well as a reduced emphasis on the peacemaking and conflict resolution by right-wing populists and nationalists, have prolonged these wars. The international community is also helpless in halting ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya minorities in Myanmar, raising doubts about protection of basic human rights. Is right-wing populism in the USA and Europe undermining international cooperation for peace? Are we sleepwalking into World War III?
Are we sleepwalking into World War III? The divisions Security Council are very deep, and it doesn't look like many of these protracted armed conflicts are going to wind down quickly, because they have become proxy wars among major powers. We have discussed this often in Foreign Pulse, but today we are asking whether there is any hope for multilateral solutions for protecting civilians, either from ethnic cleansing like we saw in Myanmar against Rohingya, or generally the barbaric attacks that have been happening targeting civilians. I was just reading David Reef in Foreign Policy, where he says that the global balance of power has shifted in favor of governments that believe in that human rights are dispensable. From an earlier era when major powers, especially the Western ones, used to, at least on paper, defend the idea of minority rights and human rights. So you have tragedies like the Rohingya happening in Myanmar, as well as the other conflicts which have been dragging on. No attempt to do any peacemaking. It seems like the populists don't really care about peacemaking at the international level, Vaseline, because diplomacy is the last option for them, because they believe in confrontation and in increasing the polarization in the international community rather than reaching a consensus. So what do we do about this breakdown of the multilateral solutions to wars?
Absolutely. It's a difficult time for human rights, and it is because the major power, United States and its president, are not interested in human rights at all. They're interested in everything else but not in human rights. Mostly they're interested in staying in power, and that's the issue with every other populist in governments around the world. Staying in power, and for that matter lying to their populations, is what they do. How I see a progress here, it's not easy to see any progress, because the current division, as you mentioned, in the Security Council, is to the point of no hope in Syria, in particular, where the big powers simply defy the security. They don't want multilateral discussions, even, not decisions. And it reminds me what one African ambassador once said back in the 70s, that if two small powers are in conflict, the conflict will disappear. If a big country and a small country are in conflict, the small country will disappear. But if two big countries in a conflict, the United Nations disappear. So that anecdote shows that they prefer bilateral or outside United Nations decisions, and that's exactly why Syrian conflict is so long and bloody, that so many people are driven out of their houses, 13 million displaced, 500,000 dead.
And
no
Veselin, on the Rohingya episode, for example, it seems that the international community is not even able to come to a consensus on this being a problem, because the way the Western powers, most of them now ruled by populist states, responded was almost like, you know, we don't even care that there is an ethnic cleansing going on. There was no pressure really put on the Myanmar military or the generals to try and hold them to account. And I don't think Trump even uttered the word Rohingya at all in all these months. So it clearly shows that the agenda has shifted, and these concerns, which used to be earlier on the high table of the international community, are now being swept under the carpet, which means abusive regimes like you have in Myanmar now have a greater say, because Trump has been befriending a lot of these, like you see in the Philippines, for example, and you know, the killing may actually intensify. So how do we protect you know, innocent people in this kind of climate of impunity, where the UN and the bigger multilateral system is you know, absent and missing in action?
Exactly. Evil happened because good people do nothing. Remember that famous sentence. And if military in Myanmar commit genocide, and people like Orban in Hungary, or Duterte in Philippines, and Donald Trump in United States,
Erdogan
in Turkey, and all of those people do not care, then the military people can continue to do what they do. I wrote recently something that illegal migrants are illegal only because governments deny their legal rights of freedom of movement. And again, I had a lot of opposition and people saying, what if people come to your house and try to occupy it? Again, the discourse is diverted in a sense that we look for our own safety, but we are isolating ourselves from global processes that at one point will hit back at us. And that's not the way to go. And
it's not the way to go, but we are indeed you know, caught in a bind, because on one hand, the democratic pressure from below of the masses and the majoritarian mobilization on these red meat issues has been you know, creating all this animosity towards the liberal solutions. So indeed it's a problem, but let's move on in the interest of time and shift to the third aspect, which has been impacted in a major way and which affects all of us, which is the climate change problem, and the way the populists have been trying to obstruct any multilateral progress towards tackling climate change. Let's listen in.
Right-wing populists deny climate change and have a very strong affinity for fossil fuel industries. Countries like USA and Poland are increasing coal-based industrial production and also defying multilateral efforts to reduce carbon emissions. Every year we are witnessing an increase in the average global temperature, while the populists are pushing the world backwards by supporting highly polluting strategies of economic growth. Is the environmental crisis reaching a dangerous point of no return? How can global warming and climate change can be mitigated in a timely manner if populists keep blocking joint multilateral action?
Joint multilateral action seems to be harder and harder to achieve, with a lot of these populists denying climate change, saying that it's a hoax, or that it's actually a kind of a strategy by their rivals to limit their economic growth. The emphasis on industrialization using the old methods of coal especially has come back in a big way, and led by Trump, they have also, as I said, vacated the international problem solving space. Most of them are out of the global governance agenda through Paris climate. I mean, many of them are saying that, you know, it doesn't really matter because these are elite things that are being imposed from outside against our national interests and against our sovereignty. So Veselin, this argument that, you know, climate decisions have to be sovereign and we have to make our own choices and should not be imposed from outside. The EU is a dictator, the UN is a dictator, and these people are coming and, you know, telling us what to do and they have no right to. This kind of thing, how do we respond to this? You know, the climate crisis is getting worse.
I think this is the biggest danger. The climate change is worse than Syria and worse than migration and everything else. So if one day the population of the globe will die, it will be because of climate change. you're right. It's not realized as such that many still use the small little suspicion here and there to ignore what's going on in the world. So another, so to speak, opportunity for populists to misinterpret, to manipulate, to lie, and to achieve their political scores. And for that matter here, we really need multilateralism for climate change. If somehow we can think of the big powers dealing with other issues by themselves, it's possible. For the climate change, everybody needs to join the reduction of CO2. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It needs to accumulate the world in one effort. And I think the Paris Agreement, to a certain extent, gives us a hope. Also because it's a different type of law. I just finished a book on climate agreements, and I find that this is a bottom-up approach where states decide nobody imposes standards. States need to come up with their own nationally determined commitments, and those commitments then become legally binding in the same time. So I find sometimes soft law, when states disagree on the hard law, it's still possible.
And it's still possible, yes, also to create a kind of a multilateralism minus the populists. Because most of the countries, including India and most of the European countries, have continued to repose faith in the Paris Accord, even though Trump is pulling out. And likewise, your trade agreements, the populists are opposed to multilateral trade system, but even though Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the remaining 11 countries have gone ahead and done their own thing. So in a way, I think there is still resistance to this wave of populism, and many are still interested in an open and liberal world order and are trying. But the question is, Vasilin, if the big powers like especially United States and some European countries are no longer on the boat, then how long can it sail and how far can the impact be? It looks like the impact on climate mitigation is going to be much smaller if the US is not on board.
I like your expression multilateralism minus populism. And I think that if we look at the previous agreements, often the United States is out of international legal agreements, but the world goes on. The life doesn't stop because United States is, again, a lot of those treaties are without the United States. League of Nations was without the United States. Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court is without the United States. And even the United States, we are talking about the president in the administration. If we look at the businesses and mayors in America, they are very supportive of renewable energy, and they see the prospect of getting more money even out of projects of clean development and so on. So
there
for
is
that
hope
matter, we need more civil society. We yes. need to go beyond the big powers only, and to create a global coalition of willing governments and mayors. Mayors are also meeting. They have
local governments, businesses,
exactly.
Unions, civic. So yes, so it's a big transnational project where we need to bring in actors other than the federal governments if those are captured by populists. So yes, so let us look at, for example, concepts like the sanctuary cities in America, where they are refusing to bow to Trump's diktat and saying that we will not deport the so-called illegal migrants because they actually bring benefits to our local economies. But nonetheless, let me conclude by saying that we do have a problem on hand, a big one. The liberal principles and values which used to be upheld by these Western countries are no longer sacrosanct, even in the citadel of the liberal order. And so as a result of it, it's a big shock. And we have to make adjustments, and we may have to look below the level of the government, beyond the level of the governments, and build coalitions. And that's the only way to stop this populist tide from completely hijacking the liberal principles on the basis of which we have international cooperation. So ultimately, there is no alternative to multilateralism. And the question is, how long will this populist wave last, and how much damaging will it be? And Vasilin, if Trump turns out to be a two-term president, I think the damage will be more, and then we'll have to see, once the populists come to power, maybe they will not be able to deliver on their promises, and after one electoral cycle, they may also start losing elections. So let's not completely give up faith in the UN and international law, international cooperation. We must continue to hope for the best, but in the meanwhile, be aware that there is this major populist threat that has basis in popular grievances, and how to address those popular grievances, many of which are based on economic disenfranchisement and inequality and the failure of globalization. We may have to save the humane part of globalization, but have to discard some of the more negative impacts of globalization which have to this populist surge. So thank you, Veselin. Thank you for joining me on today's show, for sharing your thoughts. Thank you, viewers. Let's think about these big global trends. India is not immune from them. We are very much part of the international system. We have an interest in keeping an open world where our skilled workers can travel, where we can have more trade, where we have a way of increasing our influence in the world through multilateral coalitions. And for all that, we must defend the liberal order, because at the end of the day, we are the top democracy in the developing world. And never forget that democracy is based on liberal values, and we can never give those up. So thank you all for watching, and let's keep problematizing these issues and also looking for solutions.